Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ko Maggie toko ingoa, ko Tweedie toko ingoa whānau, e whānau mai au e tūtira, i tipu aki au e tūtira. I noho ana kei te huru whenua, kei te whanganui atara, he kai whakapaho ki te radioactive.fm. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, and thank you so much to all of you for being here today, specifically the panellists. Let's start with Nia Bartley. Nia is a PSA union delegate, an elected member of 3 PSA governance committees, DHB Sector Committee, Women's Network as the Wellington Regional Representative, and current treasurer of the Pacifica Network Committee. Nia Bartley is an eco-rep, an equal pay advocate, and also on the PSA Working Group for Health New Zealand. She has also presented submissions to several select committees. Last year in August, she was elected as a Pacifica co-convener of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions and is an ETU Union Solidarity member. Nia has also supported campaigns run by the Human Rights Commission, namely Pay Transparency and the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry. I've invited Nia to do a little speech this morning that you've prepared. Kia ora. Maloni.
Maloni. Testing. Okay. So, tēnā koutou katoa, hakataloha atu, a whio mai, tala mai, a ao malo le soifua ma le langi mama greetings. It is an honour to be here and to be in fine company with these wahine toa who bring mana and inspiration to today. And also a big mihi to Nicoletta, Vogelmorn, you know, and all of you here. The theme for International Women's Day this year was #BreakTheBias. Firstly, I will share a brief history of how it is that I sit before you. My ancestors on one side of my family arrived to these shores not long after Te Tiriti was signed in the mid-1800s. They were missionaries. My great-great-grandfather was born in Devonport, Auckland. On the other side of my kāinga, my grandparents migrated here in the 1960s. And subsequently, my parents, who were sweethearts from overseas, reunited here in Wellington. They got married the following decade, and in due course, I was born. Just down the road, down in Wellington Hospital. I had a great childhood with a sister and a brother. My brother is here. And we came from a big extended family. We were well looked after and loved by our parents. After going through school and then on to university and graduating, I worked various jobs. I was a Kiwi, a brown Kiwi. For all intents and purposes, I was on my way to being the quintessential Kiwi. Or was I? Despite having a European family surname, having a good command of English, because this was the main language spoken at home, and being told that I was an eloquent speaker and that I dressed well. This was still viewed by some as still not being good enough. I didn't have the right kind of privilege to bypass certain hurdles and obstacles that many of my friends, colleagues, and some of my relatives were exempt from. You see, throughout my life, I was often asked by non-Pacific people mainly, where are you from? And not in the sense which suburb, but where are you originally from? Where are your people from? And my response often would be, where are you from? It became apparent to me quite early on that being a woman, and one often first seen as a Pacific woman, that I was viewed as not belonging to the country of my birth. It was assumed that I was a new migrant, someone not from here who didn't have roots here. I have always had to work just a little bit harder, smarter, to prove my worth. I'm sharing this because I agree bias exists everywhere, and it is innate within each and every one of us here, whether we realise this or not. On the 20th of October this year will be the 50th anniversary since the Equal Pay Act was introduced here in Aotearoa. Sadly, there's still a fair way to go before, equality is achieved, because it is more than just gender. In my opinion, Pākehā, the dominant group at the moment, needs to truly get behind in changing the stereotypes of Pacific women and men. They need to be part of the solution to fix the well-established systems and processes which continue to perpetuate the divide between those that have and the have-nots. In years to come, the population of Aotearoa will be dominated by peoples of Māori, Pacific and Asian descent. The median age for Pacific peoples is 22 years and under. For Pākehā, the median age is 43. The melting pot of Aotearoa will truly be more diverse, and hence the urgency we must take to improve how things are done, e.g. close the pay gap, provide more opportunities for women, especially women from marginalised groups, to be involved in decision making. I have witnessed and experienced the normalisation of certain groups being mistreated in the workplace as second-class citizens, women being overlooked for promotion, women not being encouraged to aim high. Add to this intersectionality, where gender and ethnicity combined are a double hit. Or triple this if you're disabled, quadruple if you're also from the rainbow community. On average, in comparison to a Pākehā male, Pacific women are being paid 73 cents for every $1 they earn. Why? I didn't know there was a pay gap until 4 years ago. True story, it was never discussed. It was a big secret. And it is not until we hear and see the effects of the pay gap that we realise this is a real thing. This is how I feel. This is my truth and that of those who came before me, and most likely for a little while will continue for future generations. It does not have to continue this way. I fully support all of us working together to quell the social injustices experienced by groups like Pacific peoples, Māori, other migrant groups, the deaf and disabled, our rainbow communities. I decided long ago never to walk in anyone's shadow. If I fail, if I succeed, at least I lived as I believe. No matter what they take from me, they can't take away my dignity. Lyrics sung by Whitney Houston. The 23rd of November 2017 was the first year anniversary of my father's passing. It was also the date that my journey commenced into activism as a workplace delegate with the PSA and other trade union activities. I truly had an epiphany that I had to do more and to use my voice to help drive change. Believe it or not, I am really quite shy, and over the course of the last 4 years, I showed courage by speaking up and out in my workplace, presenting in person and via Zoom submissions to select committees and in other areas to challenge the blatant and subtle forms of mistreatment, of exploitation of women, Pacifica, etc., etc. I wanted to improve the situation of especially Pacific women and other women from marginalised groups in the workplace and overall in our society where I could. I had had enough of the views. This is just how it is and has always been. This was my realisation that I was actually over and done with walking in anyone's shadow, and we all deserved respect. I have joined others in my workplace and within the union to demystify and change the mindsets of what had been largely paid out and accepted by many as the truth. The challenge has been out there for quite some time. It is critical that collectively we work together now to remedy the disparities across many facets of our society, because the systems of old do not work. The old boys network were never and will never be inclusive of all. And also, not all women support all women. What everyone needs to understand, if there's no justice for everyone, then there really is no justice for all. We need action and major transformation. None of us will truly be free until all of us have been liberated and collectively unite. And we must also not only just look out for each other, but also protect our planet, because we only have one. I am Nia Bartley. My bale I wear today, my head crown, is for my ancestors, my connection to all of them, my brown, my white and my yellow ancestors. My roots never forget their flowers. I am tangata o le moana, and my whanaunga a tangata whenua. I am worth 100% and more. Haka tai lahi lele.
Malo karawe. Really lovely to hear just some of your extraordinary activism and the extent of your work, Nia. Really interesting work. Can you tell me a little bit about the discrimination that began more in the 1970s when Pacifica were brought to Aotearoa to do jobs locals here refused to do, and how that has continued on today?
Well, it's actually before the 1970s.
It is.
From the colonisation period, and it's still continuing on today. So from World War I, in fact, when New Zealand came on board, part of the colonisation of the Pacific, for some of the nations like Samoa when they became independent in 1962. So it has just continued. It's this perpetuation of ensuring that the people of colour, the Pacifica people, just remain at the bottom. Whether it was conscious, I believe it was a conscious decision where through the education system in the island you could only go to school up to primary school level. It was only in the last couple of generations, if that people could seek a college education or university because they had deemed that actually we need to decide our narrative is how things work for us. And as for a lot of tangata whenua, for Māori, by Māori, the same as with Pacifica. One of the issues is that a lot of the different various groups have sort of intermingled and married, but all in all, now, if we think modern day now, when a lot of the labour came in, when my grandparents moved over for this better life of milk of honey, and my uncles, they had come beforehand, it was a lot different, but they were very proud. And then unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to talk to my father before he passed about the dawn raids that occurred in the 70s. But it was just a testament to basically how racist New Zealand was then, and it is still quite racist now. So for me, it's just a different decade, different period. I don't think, honestly, that it has really changed all that much. I think it's just become more subtle. I just think the racist systems, whilst it's being outed now, I feel that there's still a long way before things will improve. And basically, as I mentioned earlier, collectively we need to work together. It's no coincidence that Pacifica are at the bottom of the pay scale, because no one wants to be at the bottom. And the only way it can change is if the dominant groups who are in charge and have been all around the world actually accept the fact that, this is not right. Like I said, my activism came to a light ignited 4 years ago. I just accepted it was the norm, and then it hit home. This is actually quite, terrible what I'm going through. But because it was normalised, I didn't know any better because it was never discussed. So that's why it's good that the secret is out. The secret is out, and that there are more people in key roles who are actually brave enough to address, what has actually occurred. But we're still a long way from it.
And talk to me a little bit about your work addressing the Pacific pay gap specifically, and what that will do for ethnic minorities and Aotearoa more broadly.
I'm just one of many who are out there, and there'll be many more in the future. And I'm just an extension of a voice that has been humming for decades. For me, I had to actually realise that actually this is what I was experiencing. I think for me, because I actually experienced it, it's something that you can't learn as such. You can't learn from a textbook. You have to live it, and I've lived it. And I know other people who have lived it. I know people who have worked around the clock just to make ends meet. Do you know? I've seen people literally die within themselves, because this is the only line of work that they have. This is how they can survive. It's the privilege that many people aren't aware of. You think of the pandemic that's occurred. A lot of things went online. What people forgot was that not everyone could afford to connect to the internet. Not everybody had a device they could use to continue with the schooling. So a lot of things that people took for granted, not everybody had more than $5 in their account. Do you know? And so I'm one of those people that is not afraid to share the stories, not only my story, my experience, but of others who now are suffering and have suffered for a long time. And people say, oh, you really should look after yourself. But for me, I just don't know, like for humanity's sake, how can we allow other people to suffer and continue? But people have done that, and people will continue to do that until they actually realise you're actually really being quite selfish. You're really truly being selfish, you know? I think of, there's so many things, but yeah. I mean, I could go on and on, but, you know, when I think about what's happening in the Ukraine, you know, I think of those people, I think of people all around the world, all the war-torn countries and what have you, and I think about here, just something simple where we could actually live in harmony, and it's very difficult for people to share and truly embrace and look after one another. Here in New Zealand, it's never been the team of 5 million, you know, it never has been, and the rhetoric that has been shared out there, whilst I'm glad we do have Jacinda as the Prime Minister, there's still more that needs to be done, the government, but we forget that it's not just the government, we the people have a voice, and collectively we can make a difference.
Thank you so much for your very eloquent words. Sabina is a trade unionist and artist from Wellington. While working in several small retail businesses, she became a first union delegate, being involved in various efforts to improve working conditions and advocate for colleagues. Sabina is now a full-time PSA union organiser and a committee member of Unions Wellington. She also has hosted many different projects at galleries across the capital and is a curator, facilitator and board member of Meanwhile Gallery, and an artist, which is an artist-run space on Willis Street in Wellington. Kia ora, Sabina. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the work that you do and just outline for us how that impacts the lives of women positively in the workplace?
I work as an organiser in the PSA's Member Advice and Support Centre, so that's essentially on the phones, and we get calls from any of the PSA members across the country, and I talk through what's going on in their work and either provide them with support and advice at the time, or follow up with employers to get things sorted out, or I refer it on to one of my site organiser colleagues who then go forth and try and fix things for people in the workplace. The biggest group of people that call us are people from the community public services sector, which is essentially like NGOs, and the majority of our members in that space are support workers, which is a very vulnerable group of workers who are massively underpaid, and it's not a very well organised space because they tend to not have like work sites, they work in people's homes and stuff, and it's also it's a work that has been contracted out by the government to for-profit providers to exploit workers, basically. And so I talk to a lot of them. That's what most of my day is, talking to them.
And are a lot of those people female identifying?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm not sure of the exact percentage, but 70% of the PSA's membership is female identifying, and I would say that support workers is probably I don't want to throw a percentage out there that's going to be wrong, but it would be higher than that.
The role of any trade union is, of course, to protect its members. And have you always felt personally supported as a unionist, as a woman in the space?
I think that, so like I said, in my current role at the PSA, 70% of our membership is female. We have a lot of women organisers, and it tends to be, I think that historically, the idea of being a trade unionist, or the sort of archetype that people maybe have in their head, is like a furious man, and there are it's that obviously that hasn't always, not everybody, but I think that the space is changing, but there are still a few people around that have sort of slightly out of date ideas, and you do feel like you have to constantly prove yourself in the workplace, maybe more than I would like to, like once you've been hired to do a job, it's not really fair to require someone to reprove themselves every time they're doing their job in order to make it feel like you have a right to be there and that you're doing good work.
And what role does art play for you in kind of taking down those expectations that are placed on you in your kind of formal work life? How do you use art as a way to kind of debunk some of those ideas?
I guess like I haven't made a lot of art about specifically workplace issues, but I did do an art exhibition a couple of years ago that was sort of like, it was like personal protest banners. So I did all these like embroideries with slogans about I guess reacting to situations that were happening in my life, and they were sort of like embroidered placards. I think that obviously it's a creative outlet, and so I think that it's really nice to be able to have something that you can put yourself into and really care about outside of the things that you have to do in order to like get by. But then also I'm very lucky that my actual job is something that I get a lot of value and joy out of as well. So.
Can you speak to some of the issues that are facing female identifying people in the workplace that you've seen firsthand in your job? Can you tell us any kinds of stories or any kind of information that you have around that might relate to some of our audience today?
Well, I think that as all of the work that you were doing touches on, but like a lot of our we've got fair pay agreements coming through, and I would say that a lot of our female identifying workforce are facing ongoing issues where obviously their industries are underpaid because their industries are underpaid, and that's something that has been allowed to continue for a very long time, but also the work that people do, female identifying workforces tend to do, for example, like support work and caring industries, looking after the people in our communities, admin work. All of that is incredibly valuable work that we wouldn't be able to run our societies without, but obviously it has also been not recognised or respected, and that's still the case. So people are sort of, they're made to feel like the work that they do is less important than other industries, and therefore that they're not as important and that they're not deserving of.
Yeah, you're kind of reminding me of a case that I remember in Melbourne when I lived there, where two morning radio hosts were getting paid different amounts of money, and they didn't realise that until the female breakfast host said to the male breakfast host, "Oh, I'm struggling to pay ends meet with my family," and he said, "I'm not." And she said, "Well, how much are you getting paid?" And it was a difference of around $26,000. So they approached the radio station and said, "Oh, look, can you buffer up her salary?" And they said, "No, we can't afford to." So the male host took a cut so that he could be on a similar wage to her, and she could be brought up a margin of like 10K. And that was the only way they could turn the hand of the organisation, which was a real shame. The organisation couldn't do much for the employer, or wouldn't. So another employer had to meet them in the middle. And those kinds of complex things, I'm sure you see quite a lot at work, specific cases that you probably are not allowed to talk about. But that's something that I've really noticed. You see these kinds of stories time and time again.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what we're seeing, rather than like, obviously that sort of specific example does happen, and there is also bias with people who are ethnic minorities or women entering the workforce at lower pay rates for doing, substantively the same jobs. But what we're seeing, like, even more, I think, is that whole groups of workers are being underpaid because of the kind of work that they do or who they are as a demographic. So it's like less that, one colleague is being paid less than another person for doing the same job, and more that you have, just like huge groups of people whose work is not valued and who are not being paid adequately for what they do.
Thanks, Sabina. Now on to Francesca. Francesca Storey is a Senior Research Fellow with Te Tātai Hauora o Hine, National Centre for Women's Health Research Aotearoa at Victoria University of Wellington, working with Professor Bev Lawton and their iwi partners. With a background in neonatal intensive care and remote area nursing, Francesca is a named investigator on a number of research projects involving Indigenous-led solutions to eliminate preventable harm and death for wahine and pepe, which include the offering of HPV self-test to reduce cervical cancer. Francesca is part of the International Research Group for Indigenous Women's Health as well. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you do?
Kia ora koutou. So acknowledging that in talking to that work, I'm from the UK. So in a unique position, I think, and in place of Professor Bev Lawton, who couldn't be here today, who I always think, what would Bev say? And so I'm in a really quite privileged position to be working at the centre that's a kaupapa Māori research centre. So I kind of acknowledge my position, being non-Māori, talking to Indigenous methodologies and what that position can potentially do to support other non-Māori to work alongside Māori for better outcomes. And so the work I'm involved in is our vision at the centre is all about reducing preventable harm, morbidity and mortality, so that's reducing illness and that's reducing death for women and babies. So our speciality is all about women's health care, pregnancy care, cervical cancer prevention. If anyone hasn't seen our push to see HPV self-testing come in over the last 2 years, then you may have been under a rock, but I'll merrily talk to you after this. And Bev also, in her work around menopause, she's been a lead in Aotearoa to see that. That's right, it's just my notes. It's all going to go pear-shaped now. No, I'm joking. And also. And it's a challenging thing to sometimes talk to, but across our team we have those that are working to support wahine to access abortion. And so some of these things, they're the sticky stuff. We don't want to talk about mums and babies dying. People get upset when you start to say, why do more brown and black babies and mums die? But sometimes you just have to call it for what it was. And we were just talking before the panel about how you frame the work you do and how you talk to it. You want to confront, you want people to take action, you want systems to change, but you also want to bring people along with you on the waka to do that change themselves. So thinking, what would Bev say? We talk a lot about our work being, we want to use research as activism. So it's being the positive disruptors. And how can we make system change? We can all look to do individual personal changes, but really it's about having system change so that a lot of those preventable harm can be avoided. I can't actually remember what you asked me, but there you go.
No, I'm loving it. Can you just unpack a little bit more about the HPV self-testing? Because this is such an exciting area for science. And of course, it comes off the wave of Kitty Allen's campaign with Smear Your Mare. Mm-hmm.
And what Nia mentioned before about being in front of health select committees. So my background's neonatal nursing. So I have been an intensive care nurse and worked in remote areas as well, and fell into this research centre at the time when they were undertaking some work in Te Tautokoro in Northland to offer HPV self-testing. So 20, 30 years ago, no one realised that cervical cancer was caused by a virus. And eventually when that was realised, what people started to ask was, well, instead of looking for the cancer cell changes, instead of looking for that change, let's look for the virus that has the potential to cause that cancer. So if we can then support the woman to get to early preventative treatment or anything that she might need, then we're going to see less cancer. And so when I joined the team to look at all the maternal and infant health stuff I liked, they were doing a lot in this space already. And some of the how HPV self-testing got talked to, and this was before Minister Allen had her diagnosis and shared it publicly, a lot of the media talked to how it was a more acceptable test for wahine, and it was a more acceptable test for wahine Māori. You know, we'd taken away some of the elements of whakamau, shyness or embarrassment, don't do that kupu justice, but you know, some of that's taken away. The woman can do this test herself. She can do it in the wharepaku. She can do it wherever she is. But what got lost in some of that messaging was this was actually a better test. So the World Health Organization had called for the elimination of cervical cancer. That's massive and exciting. The fact that we could be, along with the vaccination, eliminating this cancer is huge. And I think some of the messaging was, it was seen that, it was taking away some barriers, and I hate that term, but barriers to care or barriers to diagnosis. But really, it was actually saying this is a gold standard test. This is the better test. And the fact that it is actually something that wahine can do themselves and is less invasive was just the cherry on the top, pardon the pun. And so we were doing a lot, and we'd taken this to the Health Select Committee, pushing for this change. And Professor Lawton has been a massive advocate in this space. And also, who's a big influencer in our team, Dame Sylvia Cartwright. You know, when I think about wahine toa and people who've worked in a challenging system of hers as in law as a wahine, she stood alongside us that day when we talked to why the programme needed to change. You know, this will reduce cervical cancer, it will save lives. And it actually happens to be cheaper and better for the women in all. So it's a no-brainer, it really is. And Minister Allen, who we had been in touch with anyway, shared her diagnosis just at the time where we were really pushing for it. And in some ways, how do I talk to this appropriately? Her campaign and her sharing her news was fantastic for some wahine who may not have had a screen, may not have had a cervical smear for ages, to come forward and have that screen. But what just broke our hearts was that actually women aren't getting the best screen. They're not actually getting the best test. And we are advocating and pushing for that change to come. And yes, there's money come. 53 million has been announced. The programme pathway should be changing as of July 23. And I'm glad this is being filmed because we're nervous. We're nervous that we're not going to get what's been promised. We're nervous that it's not going to be an equitable pathway. And we just need to keep pushing and pushing.
Can you discuss your research focus currently and what disparities you've seen in the health system experienced by Māori wahine and pepe?
Oh, what time does this finish? I'm a half glass full type of person. I'm probably quite Pollyanna. I've been working in a neonatal intensive care unit for 12 years, having moved here from the UK. And I think just over time, I just started to ask myself and ask colleagues I worked with, you know, I was not seeing the same outcomes for all. I wasn't seeing the same pathways of care for all. And I was really fortunate that I fell into a position to be able to work for Professor Bev Lawton, where we undertook a study that looked at outcomes of babies whose mums had been really sick in pregnancy. And we asked the question with panels around the team, and we de-identified, and race and ethnicity was taken out of the case notes. We asked the question, did the woman need to get as sick as she got in pregnancy? And the subsequent question, when we looked at the babies that got sick often, it's not rocket science to understand that the baby could potentially get sick as well, was that baby's sickness and is sometimes death potentially preventable? And that to me was just, it blew my mind. You know, suddenly we had some real black and white, excuse what I've said, but really just looking through notes and seeing, and it's the classic thing people talk to, it's the holes in the cheese line up. They're often not one situation, not one decision, one medication. There's often lots of things that would come together in a pathway of care that meant the woman got really sick, the baby got really sick, and sometimes the baby had died, either in utero or following delivery. These were really confronting to have to do, and for the panel to kind of work through and understand this. But when you take away the enormity of it and the sadness of it and the anger that comes with that, was most of the time it was provider-related decision-making. Now that's quite good because we can do something about that. We can provide more education. We can put systems in place to support everyone to get the same pathway of care. And that's what a lot of the work we do is all about, trying to change policy change and system change. So we see some of that individual bias, and just calling it for what it is, racism, sometimes come into the decision-making that's around that care. I could go on, but there's the time.
You've talked a bit about your work in a neonatal role as a neonatal nurse prior to becoming a research fellow. And of course, we know nursing is a female-dominated workforce, and we've seen nurses struggle to get their role in health recognised. Have you seen that, I think I know the answer to this, sex-based undervaluation of nurses firsthand?
I really want to give a really clever answer to this, but how to talk to this? We know that the nursing workforce is primarily female. We know the medical workforce is primarily male. Historically, it always has been. So I think the challenge more is around the hierarchy in medicine to some degree, which probably is, and what sits behind that is the difference in sexes and what that brings. I've been really lucky to some degree that because I think probably I ended up in women's healthcare and neonatal care, a lot of the time I was working with medical docs who were women. So I've been really fortunate. I had lots of wahine toa to support and guide. But also I've been in nursing in a time period where we have great nurse leaders. We have great, nurse practitioners who are running and operating in the same way. But let's not pretend that isn't a factor. And that's probably also why I've enjoyed my step over into research. I work in a, not intentionally so, it's a female workforce led by Professor Bev Lawton. And along with our kaumātua, we're really well supported to push those. But in academia, I can see that there's going to be some interesting times ahead. There's a lot of transparency at the moment in the place that I work and in how things work in terms of we know each other's salaries. We see that because everything's grant-based. But whether the same opportunities are there for someone who wants to progress in academia, definitely not.
Just curious as to what's been more empowering, being able to be in a role of care, nursing, or being able to apply that in research and work in a research role.
I think it goes back to that comment around the idea of being at the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. I love my neonatal nursing background. I love being able to be there at 3 o'clock in the morning when a premature baby's born, and you do what you can to support that baby in that whānau and look after everyone. But those babies keep coming, and so I can keep hopefully doing a good job, but no one's changing what the condition is that meant that baby was born prematurely. So whilst I really miss the hands-on care and building relationships, I realise it goes back to that researchers' activism. We need to change the system. I need to be involved, and I'm involved in research that means that hopefully every woman is going to get offered the same pathway of care. There will never be a comment that if a borderline viability baby is born, so a baby who's born maybe around 23 or 24 weeks, which is really challenging, and you don't know the survivability of the chances of survivability for that baby, that there won't be a comment in the room about how many other children that woman has. So how proactive are we in that resuscitation? I would hate to think of the conversations that go on sometimes in relation to someone's background and what they bring. So if I can be involved in something that's going to change the system, then I'm good with that.
It's a bit of a common thread between you three. Now let's hear from Adaire. Adaire Hannah is a communist, a unionist, and recently retired teacher. She played an active role in New Zealand and Australia's women's movement. Adaire was an active member on WONAAC from the early 1980s and participated in the fight for a private member's bill to legalise abortion in the early 1990s. She was also a member of Choice, which organised defence demonstrations in response to anti-abortion activists trying to prevent women from entering the Wellington abortion clinic. As a fighter against all forms of oppression, Adaire has recently stood beside trans people as they have been attacked by organisations such as SUFW. While she has been involved in several unions over her working life, her main political activity in the union movement was in the NZEI and PPTA. A key union campaign she was involved in was the fight against the national government's attack on adult community education. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. I want to link this back to International Working Women's Day first, because this is a meeting about this issue. International Working Women's Day was 8 March, originated in 1908 when female needle trades workers in New York marched for an 8-hour day, end of child labour and equal suffrage for women. On 8 March 1917, Petrograd's women textile workers led a strike of over 90,000 workers. This event was the beginning of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution made 8 March into a holiday for working women and made the point that working men were in struggle together with working women. This was against some feminists who wanted International Women's Day to be a women's only event. Krupskaya, a senior member of the Bolshevik Party, wrote, and I quote, "That which unites women with working men is stronger than that which divides them. They are united in their common lack of rights, their common needs, their common conditions, and their common goal." End of quote. A long time ago, in the late 1960s, when I was very young, I spent 2 university summer holidays working in the Napier tobacco factory. We women were the labourers, while the few male workers were mechanics, a more privileged layer. Whenever one section of the workforce went on strike, the other section usually worked. That is, they scabbed, so gains were few. The factory employed a forewoman whose main responsibility was keeping us women in line. During my second university holiday, I discovered after Christmas that there were practically no cigarettes left in the stockpile, so the factory was dependent on everything that came off our machines. This was a time when we had strength, so I began talking with the women about taking action for better pay and conditions. These talks taught me that the division between male and female workers and between skilled and unskilled workers undermined our strength. Napier's summers are hot, very hot, and the heat from the heaters on the machines added to that. The factory was stifling, so we called in the union. A union official arrived, walked around the aisles next to the forewoman with his shirt sleeves rolled up. He did not talk to any of us before he left, and the forewoman had the pleasure to tell us that the factory was deemed not too hot. This was my first engagement with a union. I learnt 5 important lessons from working beside these women. The gender division in the workforce has to be overcome. We will not win if we do not fight together. A woman boss is a boss, not my sister. Our unions are important defence organisations, but they're not always our defenders. That blacklisting of workers must be stopped, and that I needed to find a revolutionary organisation that would provide me with the skills and knowledge to be an effective unionist. Leap forward a few decades to 2009, when the National Party Minister of Education was Hekia Parata. She cut the funding to adult community education's budget, which catered for 22,000 adult students, from $16 million to $3 million. At the same time as she made these cuts to public education, she gave an additional $35 million to private education. The school I worked at was one of the biggest providers of adult community education. The Secondary School Teachers Union, the PPTA, had a completely pathetic response, not much more than suggesting members' right to members of Parliament. Our branch of the union decided we had to do more to support our adult community education tutors, so a resolution to strike was passed and we began to organise. There were lots of talks about tactics. We liaised with our adult community education colleagues, wrote press releases, informed our community, came up with chants and slogans for placards and banners, stood on the street corners of a major intersection before school with placards, and we held a very noisy preschool rally outside the Ministry of Education offices. Our caretaking staff, who were not members of our union, made polls for the placards. Our staff room after school was often a hive of industry. 2 days before the strike was held, I was called to head office of the union, where I was dressed down by the president and 4 senior members. The President demanded that I agree to call off the strike then and there. It was illegal. The union was up for a $100,000 fine, and every participant was up for a $10,000 fine. Of course, I said it wasn't up to me to call off the strike. The decision was the branch's. The next day, we held a branch meeting to discuss the head office's demand. The branch reaffirmed its decision to strike. So teachers, students and community marched from school to Parliament. The strike was a high point. We had understood and acted on the principle that an injury to one is an injury to all. Several teachers said that for the first time they felt like real union members, not just fodder for an event organised by someone else. How do these stories about two actions of unionists relate to the topic, break the bias? Bias and prejudice are part of the arsenal of the capitalist rulers to maintain power, divide and rule. Male against female, white against non-white, religious divisions, straight versus the rainbow community, employed versus unemployed. Luxem calling workers bottom feeders is a perfect example of his class bias. Workers must fight against all such prejudices. It is these chains which maintain our exploitation and oppression. The 1991 Employment Contracts Act, which was later called the Employment Relations Act, restricted the right to engage in industrial action except during our contract negotiations, which are limited to wages and conditions. The union movement's failure to fight this appalling piece of legislation with the necessary strong strike action has left the union movement in its current state. Life cannot be divided into politics and money. We unionists must join together to defy this legislation. Yes, that means defying the law, a law deliberately fashioned by the bosses and their representatives in government, Labour and National, against workers' ability to exercise our right to fight bias and prejudice, in other words, exploitation and oppression. The most important thing going on in the world right now is the war in Ukraine, and thanks for mentioning it, Nia. In its own way, this war poses the same lessons for workers that were posed in my Napier factory example. The workers of the West and Russia have no interest in fighting this war. It is a war, just like the wars that wrecked Iraq, Afghanistan and Syria, by bosses and governments that are run for bosses. We must heed the call of Marx, workers of the world, unite. The workers of Alexandropolis and Thessalonica port rail workers have refused to load NATO arms shipments destined for the war in Ukraine. They have the right idea. The Thessalonica Union Congress passed this resolution, and I quote, "No involvement of our country in the wars in Ukraine that are taking place for the profits of the few at the expense of the people. We will not become complicit in the passage of the war machine through territories of our country. Remember that Greece is a NATO member, and so this political strike is a significant event and is also highly likely to be against Greek law. I salute these Greek workers and call on workers around the world to follow their example." Kia ora.
Where to next? No, that was extraordinary. You're a natural storyteller, a gifted storyteller, and I think about that tobacco factory in Napier. I think it was built in 1931 after the earthquakes, wasn't it? It's an Art Deco building. It's a historic site, yeah.
Beautiful building.
Isn't it? Outside, obviously inside a totally different story, yeah, which works as a perfect metaphor for what we're discussing. Yeah, where do we need to go in terms of of women's rights in the workplace. So obviously you've talked about, some of the history of your work life, and I wonder, breaking the bias in our lifetimes, what are some of the central issues you see?
Well, obviously equal pay is extraordinarily important. But I think my message really is that we need to have, if we don't have militants with a program that says we must fight together against this exploitation or oppression, we won't win. I know in my union that whenever we have a pay contract, there will be a situation where a large section of the workforce will get a big pay and will get a reasonable pay increase, but another section of the same workforce will actually not get a good deal. And the majority will vote, that suits me to have that pay agreement, forgetting about their colleague who's possibly sitting next to them or certainly is working next to them. And we have to get rid of that idea that I look after number one and that's it. So there's also that whole thing about, when nurses go out on strike, what do we teachers do? Well, we teach. When teachers go out on strike, what do the nurses do? They nurse. They go to work. What happens when the cleaners at a hospital or some other industry go on strike? Well, we all go to work. And that is actually wrong. We should be stopping and going and joining their picket lines and saying, as a group, we unions are not going to work until this situation is changed. And that doesn't matter whether it's a Labour government you're fighting against or a national government. In my union, you often hear, can't strike now, because if you strike now, Labour won't get back into power. Well, actually, Labour has to earn any vote. It shouldn't be given to them as a right. They have to earn it. That means they need to take actions that really work for the employed, the unemployed, the low paid. Right? So, we need unions that actually fight as a collective, not as I'm looking after my patch.
Thank you so much, Adaire, and thank you to all of you for your incredible responses. And do either of you have any questions for each other before I hand it over to the audience to ask some questions?
I just want to say that I'm wearing orange today in support of my allied colleagues of the DHB sector. So please support our allied sector members. Far and wide, with the hospitals, people only recognise doctors and nurses, but there is a big backbone of other staff there. There's admin workers and at the moment allied workers. They're your occupational therapists, they're your physios, they're your speech therapists. So they're having like Orange Fridays, but I didn't wear orange on Friday. I wasn't feeling orange on a Friday, so I've decided to wear orange today. But please support them in any of the claims that are out there, because really at the end of the day, it's all of us together. And I tautoko what Adaire has shared, that really absolutely agree with regards to the unions. All unions should support each other, and there's a big movement. I think for us, we've become too complacent and forgotten our purpose and what we are capable of doing. So that's just what. And I just want to say thank you, and it's been great, sitting on this panel with these wonderful women and sharing their experience and stories. And no one asked me any questions.
I was wondering, this is just to everyone, including yourself, Maggie, how do you keep track of your own biases? And once you've noticed them, how do you challenge them? Because a lot of, for me, I guess a lot of my biases would be so unconscious. And I think I've got friends who help sort of check me. But how has that experience been for you? And what do you do to sort of unpack those?
Happy to chuck in an answer to that. Yeah, certainly. I think that's partly why I ended up working where I'm working, you know. And I probably hadn't really started paying attention or even thinking about the biases that I carried with me until I ended up involved in some of the studies, you know, and that whole thing where I made that comment about looking at black and white documentation, if you like, of pathways of care and what decisions had influenced in terms of outcomes was, put bluntly, a slap in the face. I think I'm challenged pretty much daily to pay attention to the biases that I can. And I work with a really good, supportive raupo, mostly of wahine, but we have a kahui of kaumātua, so a group of elders across New Zealand who kind of inform the work and work alongside us in the work. And it's one of the kaumātua there that's kind of got me on this journey of my PhD, because he's like, actually, this is what we need you to do. We need you to think through this, take that time to think about, well, what is it you need to bring and change and share it, you know, not in a look what I learnt type of way, but actually how do we safely pay attention to that? How do we support others to keep doing that? Because it's necessary in our line of care when we're talking addressing racism. Kia ora.
I didn't really want to say anything, but I will say that I'd like to think that I don't have any biases, but as I mentioned earlier on, we all do. I just like to think mine are probably on the minimal scale compared to, say, perhaps others, but that's not true. That's just me. But it's been good to actually meet other people, and then it reflects back on you and you think, wow, you know. So good reflections in the last few years especially, and no doubt will continue until I leave this earth. But how do I keep it in check? I think people, I'm fortunate that people will say to me, you know, like my partner who isn't of Pacifica heritage, you know, so we have quite robust conversations and we agree to disagree. But it's just a learning experience. I think we just have to embrace it and own it, you know, own it and not just sort of sit on it. You know, you can sit on it for a little while, but you need to actually learn from it and actually make a change. And as I mentioned, it's through action and transformation as well, and then you apply it in your everyday life and with everyone that you're in contact with, you know. So if you're in the workplace, do it there. If you're, you know, in your own family, sometimes it's more difficult because I think, especially people that you're close to, and it can cause actual division as well, you know, but that's part and parcel of life. And I think those moments you discover who is actually true and are there for you, because at the end of the day, you only really, as long as you're okay with yourself as well and the people that you come into contact with, you know. But that's my response.
I guess I feel like I try and spend a lot of time listening to people to try and understand where they're coming from, and therefore use that to inform how I'm going to, I guess, rework my thinking about things. In the role that I'm in, I talk to a lot of people who are like in trouble at work. And sometimes when you initially like hear about what somebody has done is, it can make you kind of be like, oh. But then when you talk to them about what they actually did and why they did what they, you know, what their reasoning behind it was and all of the situations, it can really change how you feel about it, and you can understand where they were coming from. And obviously they're entitled to be supported anyway, and that's, you know, my role in it. But you do... throughout the process, it does change the way you see the sort of like initial thing. And I think that doing that all the time helps you in all situations in your life to just like be like, this is my initial response, but why am I thinking that? And maybe I need to listen to everyone around me to figure out, and particularly centre the person who's like telling me a thing to make sure that I'm...
Well, I think families are the breeding ground for bias. I remember very clearly that I had two brothers, and any money in the family was for the boys, because boys have to, you know, get married and support a family. Girls get married. I also, found books. I read very widely. And there were all these challenges, and I'd have all these phenomenal arguments. My parents thought I was the most dreadful child because I constantly said, well, why does it have to be like that? I don't think that's right. And so I became sort of the squeaky wheel in the home. And I also remember quite clearly one of my older brother's friends coming out as gay, and I remember my parents' reaction to that this person who had been in and out of our house because he lived over the back fence was no longer acceptable, couldn't come in. And I was absolutely horrified. What had changed? This was the same guy that we had for years invited in, and suddenly this person is a non-person. And so those experiences, and my family was no different from most other families in this. Oh, that's not a person. You shouldn't be a friend with that person. Can't be a friend with that person. You see at school occasionally, because Timaru is not renowned for its multiculturalism, well, certainly not in those days. But I do remember a family friend who asked her Tongan mother not to come to the school anymore. This young woman was a boarder. She was blonde, blue-eyed, but Mum was not blonde or blue-eyed. And the racism at the school was such that don't come. How hurtful can that be, not only for the girl, but also for the mother? So I think it's extremely important that we are challenged and be open to be challenged. That when you work with teenagers, as I have for a long time, you're constantly challenged, and it is really important to be able to think, I'm not sure what I think about that, just like you were saying. And you've got to, so if we have a closed mind, which I think my parents to a large extent did have for a long period of time of their life, then we don't challenge our biases. We're not even aware that they're biases. That's normal. Well, life throws us curved balls, and we have to be prepared to sit down and look clearly at ourselves and say, not a good response.
Can I add something to that as well? It got me thinking as everyone was talking about. I think in terms of, yes, reflection is key, but also it's paying attention to how we're receiving messages, and how we pass messages on. So when we think about headlines, when we think about how outcomes are talked to, so there's a real responsibility in the media to look after how they tell a story and look after how they share, particularly statistics. We all love something clickbait, whatever it is. And I think it's been a real shift for me, but part of the research group, and I keep talking about that, but one of the things we've been trying to do, and there are other Māori academics out there doing this, is when we're talking about outcomes, we can really challenge the reader, the news reader, whoever's talking to that story, if we talk about the privilege of, for example, Pākehā in terms of pathways and outcomes. So instead of talking and in relation to an outcome, let's say it's related to, fresh in my head, Māori have 3 times the maternal mortality rate, so dying during childbirth or after childbirth compared to Pākehā. But what if we actually say, why is it that, let's make Māori the norm and say, well, why are Pākehā 3 times more privileged to not have mortality? So sometimes it's about who do we make the norm in what we're talking to, and if we can do that more in some of the news and things that we talk to, again, it helps to take away some of that bias that's sitting there, or it challenges it.
Thank you. That actually makes me think too, because right now, you look at the bias in the media. You look at the bias about what's going on in Ukraine. And I assure you that the saying, the first casualty of war is truth. And I am absolutely astonished at the flipping over of people just immediately. evil Russia. Now, I am not a fan of Putin or his government. I'm totally opposed. In fact, I'd probably be in jail if I was in Russia, if not dead. But the fact is that, Russia went into the Ukraine after having argued that being surrounded by missiles that are aimed at Russia, there had to be a line drawn, that the Ukraine to be having NATO and US missiles focused on them, as the same way that these same countries are circling China, is, it's too much. That if the Ukraine was incorporated into NATO, then there would be missiles 4 minutes away from Moscow. Now, you could imagine, just think back, when I was a young teenager, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know if many people know about that. But, the United States, JFK, that nice, sexy, young president, he had his finger, supposedly, not quite, on the button because Cuba had the cheek to ask the Soviet Union to put some missiles in to stop the United States and the Cuban refugees in Florida from physically attacking Cuba. And so Russia put on some missiles. Oh, America just about exploded in anger and things. And I remember quite clearly the real fear amongst young people that, my God, there's going to be a nuclear war. Now, China is thinking of doing something in the Solomons. Oh, that's our backyard, says New Zealand. Not having that. But look at all the American bases that are in the Pacific. I mean, for goodness sake, where are the brains of these journalists, I wonder? Well, they've got a bias, and their bias is to support the bosses against the little people, the workers of the country. It's not our war, nothing to do with it, and we should do what the Greeks have done.
What do the Greeks do?
The Greeks have said, we're not rail workers, the port rail workers have said, no NATO armaments will be put on our trains and taken to the Ukraine.
Any other questions from the audience?
I was just kind of wondering your thoughts on fair pay agreements thing, and whether what kind of potentials you see for gender and racial pay equity, or maybe if you're a bit nervous about it being utilised to full potential.
Not me. Not a question for me.
I guess I'm pro fair pay agreements. I think that it's one of the biggest shifts in terms of workers' rights in quite a long time. I think that the fact that they're actually using tools to try and recognise, the way that it works, right, is you get a group of workers and then you job size it against a male-dominated workforce that has sort of similar levels of qualifications. And so the fact that you're actually looking at, that's a very simplistic version of it, but yeah. The fact that people are actually looking at female-dominated workforces and trying to recognise the work that is being done there and the importance of it against other groups of workers is really incredible, and I think that will change a lot of people's lives. So that's good. We also have, there are tools being put in place as well to try and, you were actually going to ask me about this previously, but we had, there's a tool that's been developed by the Public Service Commission, Te Waru, which is supposed to, it's a job sizing thing that instead of people being instead of using market data in order to figure out how much people should be paid in a role, they're trying to recognise the fact that there is bias within how jobs are paid currently, and to, within the sizing of the role and how things are being paid, recognise that because bias exists, the current pay rates are not fair, and so it should, you should look at the work that is being done, and recognising, I guess, cultural competencies in terms of people's jobs, and try and close the ethnic and gender pay gap through that. So that's like a free tool that's available through the Public Service Commission, and I think that along with fair pay agreements is, it's a really positive shift for workers, but it is also, there's lots of other things that need to happen as well, but those two things are going to be really good.
Yeah, I think something else that often comes up with the gender pay gap, people always talk about, oh, well, women take time off to have children. But, well, and that's the thing, right? Like, are men encouraged to take the parental leave, or is work making that a bit of a slippery slope? Is there still a bit of bias in that? But then the fact that people pretend that the gender pay gap has existed only after women have children, it exists before women have children, or if women don't have children at all. And that's something that I always like to talk to people about. If someone's having that conversation with me, it exists before you have a family.
I would just like to say that the fair pay agreement, is supportable. It's a reform, but it must not replace workers taking action. If it is, then I assure you it'll be a real dive to the lowest of possible common denominators. So our militancy, our ability to organise and to fight as a conscious workers, that we have an important role to play, and that is to change society, to get rid of capitalism. Thanks.
Any other questions? Maybe one more.
One more question?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what I heard before. I was wondering what the panel see as potential solutions to the fact that women, much more than men, are expected to dedicate a lot of their life to unpaid labour, like raising a family. And I was wondering what the panel see as potential solutions to the fact that that's, expected of women, and a large proportion of the labour performed by women goes unpaid.
Yeah, well, there's a study that just came through from the University of Bath. I was just reading this incredible journalist's work for The Guardian yesterday, talking about married women doing the sheer force of domestic labour, even though they were getting paid more than their male counterpart at home, which was interesting. The fact that the female breadwinner is still doing the bulk of the domestic labour. It's something that suggests that maybe we feel that women, the idea that girls can do everything, but should women do everything? Yeah.
It's a cultural thing. Definitely growing up, so we're fortunate, had both parents at home, and I know that there were a lot, growing up, had cousins and friends who didn't always have the dad home, or, and so we were fortunate to be raised with two parents, both home. Dad was able to work, and just dad, and then mum got a job later on part-time. But now it's a real struggle. You've got children who are being raised with, not having parents necessarily there all the time. And from a cultural perspective, women are always doing more. And it's not even something that is, it's just natural. It's just, it's not ever just the nuclear family, it's extended families and the communities. So they don't look at it. It's like, for instance, the relationship between grandparents and their mokopuna. They're more than happy to look after their children. But now there's that sort of shift where they know that there could be payment, to be received from that. So there's been a shift in the thinking that actually I should actually be being paid. And in some relationships, family relationships, the children are paying their parents because they would have to pay childcare anyway, do you know? And so that works. That's a win-win situation if that is the case. I think with regards to the unpaid work, it's kind of a difficult thing from my perspective, because whilst I know that there is an entitlement, I know that culturally it's never been about the money, you know? It's been about looking after your own, looking after the children, looking after your family. You know, it's that humanity, and I think that's something that's missing in this Western culture that is predominantly here in Aotearoa. Do you know, that's why I think for myself, I was always told, play the game. I never played the game. I was not good at playing the game. I just called it out for what it was, hence I was always in trouble. Granted, they never got security. I was never escorted off a building or anything, but, you know, it just went against the grain for me. And I think that's something that is quite unique, I think, with Pacifica families and Māori families, you know. It isn't always about the money, and as a result of that, that's why a lot of women are working multiple jobs, because they're not being paid what they're worth, because they still need to put the food on the table, they still need to pay the rent or the mortgage, they still need to do whatever, and often they're not thinking of themselves. They're not thinking of themselves, and that's what I think with the mindset. Other families, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but they do actually just only think about themselves. They don't care about anybody else. When I was growing up, my father used to put on the best barbecues in the world, right? I've never, ever had a fabulous barbecue like my father used to put on. And he used to say to the neighbours' kids, go home and get a fork, right? The kids would go home and get a fork in the cupboard. Dad was feeding those kids. The neighbours, their parents, they weren't doing the same, because their budget was only for their family. But my parents, they were accustomed to sharing, you see. These values, it's the values which are different. That is what I've struggled with most of my life, because I've had to not only take to the workplace or to a different gathering that isn't, you know, can't relate to the values I have. So in answer to your question, I'm sorry if I've kind of, you know, gone off tangent, but yeah, it's not always about the money, but it should be, because at the end of the day, that's how we pay our utility bills. That's how we survive. It's not like in the islands and traditionally where you could swim out, spear a fish, climb a tree and get, you know, that isn't possible here. And even if it was, it's all communal owned, you know, the land and what have you. It's very different here, very different here. So for me, it's the values. It's the values. The value system is different. And like with Adaire here, I mean, I never really knew about socialism until you came on board, and I'm just like, okay, go for it, you know, because really I'm like an undercover Polynesian panther, okay? And so I'm thinking, oh, maybe I should get together for Adaire later and we can talk about tactics and stuff like that. But in all seriousness, yeah, that's for me. It's the values. The values here, I think, are misguided here in New Zealand at the moment in the workplace. With fair pay agreements, I think they will be a good thing. They will be a good thing, but yeah, heed the warning as what Adaire has mentioned, you know, as long as it doesn't compromise the voice of the people now.
Okay, there is some. I think the family is incredibly important. You're trained in the family as to values. So Nia's family trained in a different way than my family. You know, I definitely had a different upbringing from my brothers. I made my brothers' beds every morning after I made my own until I was 16, when I knocked my brother's chess set over as I was making his bed, and he told me exactly what he thought of him, and I told him exactly what I thought of him, and that he could make his own bloody bed from now on. But that was an expectation. And, you know, when I was working at the cigarette factory, the forewoman's niece lived next door to my mother, and my mother came up to me and she said, "You're shaming me. You are to stop this stuff at that factory because you're shaming me." And I said, well, sorry, Mum, but you're just going to have to put up with it. And my father said, change your name. But it also reminded me of the president of the Seamen's Union. I worked in their office for a very short time in 1970-something, I think. And Pincer Martin talked to me about the 1951 strike. And he was talking about the shame his father had, because his father was a docker and he couldn't work and there was no money coming into the family. So Mum had to go and take in washing, if I remember the story correctly. She took in washing and she had to do it. And he was brought up onto the belief that a man had to provide for the family. And the shame of the fact that he couldn't do that was actually really mental health problem. And I think, we need to change. Our families actually are the incubator of a lot of the biases and prejudices and things that happen to us. So, we need to think seriously about that.
Well, let's think seriously about that over a cup of tea, maybe a coffee, an iced tea, a bit of kai, and continue those conversations outside of this panel discussion today. And really looking forward to seeing Rachel Andy perform. We're going to have a bit of a break for food, and then Rachel will be back with some music. Ngā mihi nui, kia koutou. Thank you so much for these enlightening discussions today, and a big thank you to our friends at Vogelmorn for this incredible event.
And a big thank you to Maggie.
Yes.
Child, I never knew enough what they'll do to me. The wave of love is a transient hug. Water's the shell and we are the nut. But I saw a hand arch outside the barrel. Look at all the peaches. How do you celebrate? I can't appear inside nowhere. It's already dead. I know you have a dove. I'm not getting wet. Looks like a date, he said. Show the ferret to the egg. I'm not getting wet alone. I rushed in to hold down your page, and now asleep sideways. You do not read with me. I hear a song from inside the maze, the very one you made. You sure got the ivory mantle. As a bullet I knew to be gentle. When you have a child, so begins the braiding, and in that braid you stay. Look at all the peaches. I want to celebrate. I can't appear inside nowhere. It's already dead. I know you have the dove, I'm not getting wet. Looks like Daddy said, show the ferret to the egg. I'm not getting wet alone. It's already dead. I know you have the dove, I'm not getting wet. The barrel, looks like Daddy said, show the ferret to the egg. I'm not getting wet alone. Barrel, bum 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 bum.
Thank you so much.